next session, speaking of order then, it is only appropriate that we invite our panelists to take their seats so we can initiate our subsequent discussion on American decline and New World Order. Our panelists for today are David Oldroyd-Bolt, a British historian, political consultant, and columnist at the Catholic Herald and Telegraph, who perhaps is not here just yet. We also have Dr. Gladden Pappin, the Associate Professor at the University of Dallas and a visiting MCC Senior Fellow. We have Karlyn Bowman, a Distinguished Senior Fellow Emeritus at the American Enterprise Institute. We have Dr. János Horváth, the Ambassador to the Organization of Turkic Nations. We have our very own Dr. Ophir Havery, a visiting fellow at the Danube Institute. And we have Neil Ferguson, the Milbank Family Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution, Stanford, and a Senior Faculty Fellow at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard. Ladies and gentlemen, I would invite you to give a warm hand to our panelists. Thank you very much.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I shall begin by thanking John and Melissa for inviting me here, and by saying what a great honor and pleasure it is to follow Tony Abbott. A great deal of which he has said will have some bearing on what I say. Now, the title of my lecture I was given was How We Got Here, which rather made me feel like the man in the Monty Python sketch who was asked to summarize La Recherche de Tom Perdu in 30 seconds. But I assure you I won't be breaking into song. I'd like to talk primarily about the Anglosphere and about culture, and about this alliance that perhaps has gone unregarded over the past 30 or 40 years because of the rise of China and because still of the dominance of the United States. But I think it is an extremely important global grouping. If you talk about the Anglosphere, you may not know what I mean. It is the United States, it is the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Some would bring India into this, but for the purposes of this talk, I shall leave them out. It was Tommy Lascelles, Sir Alan Lascelles, the private secretary to King George VI and Queen Elizabeth II, who said, Anglo-American relations will be all right so long as nobody tries to improve them. And I think that this was for many years the dominant theme of the Anglo-American relationship, that we rubbed along well, that we had an understanding between us based on the common law, based on language, based on religion, of course. We, the Protestant and Reformed, and they with their various ideas of Protestantism, Catholic thought being a minority at this point. But I think that that idea that we should leave alone and let it develop organically has led to, over the past 40 years particularly, but very specifically over the past 25 years, a real misunderstanding between America and Britain. Some of which, on the right, I fear has come to be deeply reactionary and misplaced. It was our own John O'Sullivan who said on Firing Line in 1990 that America and Britain are a single cultural community. That idea has warped and waned, and I think the great wane began with Suez, the Suez Crisis of 1956, when it was conceived by a great many on the British right that America was trying, through force and diplomacy, to take what was left of the British Empire for itself. This was, of course, true. There can be no denying it. But the point remained that it was, in fact, in our interest that America should have done this, that America should have taken up the mantle of empire. And if you look at those countries that America has intervened in over the past 70 years, those countries where America has put in a great deal of aid effort, those countries where America has strong diplomatic ties, they are, to a great degree, the former colonies of the British Empire. Harold Macmillan recognized this very clearly. He had a great affection for America, which was strengthened by a familial connection with John F. Kennedy. It was Macmillan who said that we should be to the Americans as the Greeks were to the Romans, a sort of civilizing elder brother or avuncular figure. Lady Thatcher, of course, recognized this most strongly, and her collaboration with Ronald Reagan, her deep affection for America, but also her recognition that by maintaining the structure of the Anglo-American agreement, they could defeat communism, was, I think, one of the most important and also most difficult decisions taken by a British premier in the post-war period, because don't underestimate the degree to which the British right and aspects of the British left were and remain deeply anti-American. The problem, I think, for many on the right now came under Tony Blair. and what they would conceive as being a supine adherence to whoever happened to be the American president of the day decided should be policy. All the grit and determination that characterized Mrs. Thatcher's relationship with Ronald Reagan. You only have to think of the invasion of Grenada and indeed the Falkland Islands, where Mrs. Thatcher had to stiffen the sinews of the State Department and of Reagan himself. All of that resolution seemed to have been lost under Mr. Blair and his successors. I cannot think of a single instance worth mentioning to you today of a post-Blair British Prime Minister standing up for British interests against American. And this passes into culture, or rather is an adjunct. Culture is an adjunct to this. And it's what I have termed the Friendsification of British culture. Now, you may all remember the American sitcom Friends, broadcast between 1994 and 2004. I think it is a perfect example of how, through cable television, through wider global communication, and through a loss of cultural confidence in the other parts of the Anglosphere, we came to assume American ideas, and even American ideas of language. One instance of this being this appalling trend nowadays to turn nouns into verbs and verbs into nouns, so that Melissa might have been said to gift me an invite, which to an Englishman is a real wrench to say, I have to tell you. And this has really bred resentment on the right, because there has always been suspicion of European culture among the British, but particularly on the conservative side of things, while recognizing that it is a culture worth admiring, studying, and to some degree emulating. You only have to think of the composers of the late 19th and early 20th century, who were very clearly influenced by Brahms, and in the case of Vaughan Williams, studied with Ravel, to see that there was an appreciation, while at a distance, and an idea that we should have a culture of our own. What I think many on the British right see now is that our culture has, over the past 25 years, given up. That everything that we do now, our television, our radio, our novels, our film, is a sort of thin imitation of American culture. That our language and thought has become a thin imitation of American language and thought. And I think this needs to be borne in mind when we are going to talk about the Anglosphere as being a potential part of the great power structure of the next, say, 25 years. That this resentment simmers. Unless it is addressed, it will not allow the Anglosphere to flourish. And one of the simmering resentments was characterized by the rather ill-advised comments of President Obama at the time of Brexit, or the time of the Brexit referendum. It is perfectly reasonable for an American president to offer a view on a referendum made by one of its closest and greatest partners about their trading relationships. What I think it was not permissible to do, and where I think the criticism was just, was that President Obama's comments went well beyond what would normally be expected. Just as President Biden's criticisms of Liz Truss's economic policies went far beyond what would normally be expected. There is this idea now that the Americans can talk to the British and not take our feelings, our history, and our intellectual hinterland into regard. The opinion pages of the New York Times are the perfect demonstration of this. And if you have half an hour to spare and want to be amused, I suggest you go and look at some of the wilder things that they have written about Britain since 2016. I want to turn now to America. I've talked a great deal about Britain in the first 5 minutes of this talk. I want to turn now to America and to think about how we have got to where we are with America. The first thing to recognize is that American institutions have by and large been compromised, entirely compromised by the Gramscian left and by its ideas. The 68 I think, they are one of the most effective political movements of the post-war period. To give you an instance of this, there was a study done of Harvard academics this year. 82% of those academics said that they were on the liberal or the very liberal side of the political spectrum. 1% said that they were on the conservative side of the spectrum. Think of the impact, ladies and gentlemen, that this has. Think of the deeply, deeply corrosive impact this has on the freedom of thought in American universities. Now, that same trend carries on in British universities, Australian universities, Canadian and New Zealand universities. The institutional collapse of America, the way that the conservative right simply did not see this danger for what it was, this well-planned campaign for how deep it went, is, I should submit to you, one of the real failures of America in the past half century. Because these were not hidden aims. Anybody who cared to do so could look up the works of Gramsci, look at the works of the Frankfurt School, and see precisely what the aims would be once they got a toehold in these institutions. And yet nothing was done. Why is this? Well, I suppose, to a degree, what Karl Popper called the paradox of tolerance, that we think that we should give our intellectual opponents the breadth and space to express their opinions, and indeed, sometimes, the ability to practice them, just so that the rest of us, or the rest of the world that's less politically involved, can see how poor they are. The left will never, and has never, given us that opportunity ourselves. In every instance that you can think of, the left will close down debate on the right, delegitimize the right's ability to speak in public. Cancel culture is a direct consequence of this policy. And we knew it was going to happen, and we did nothing. To turn back for a moment to the Blair cabinet, to Britain and therefore to the first two cabinets of Tony Blair, the journalist and writer Peter Hitchens, brother of Christopher Hitchens, has pointed out again and again and again just how deep the communist infiltration of the Labour Party as a student movement had been in the 1960s and 70s, and how many of the people in Blair's cabinets came through that movement. And had, you can just mention Peter Mandelson as one of the guiding lights of New Labour. To think that they would have changed their minds so drastically is, I think, a foolish thing. And to think, therefore, that their policies in government would have been any different from their inclinations as students, however more they were subtilized and however more they were sharpened, is foolish. I think the same has happened on the American left. You don't need me to tell you this, but it is worth pointing out. And it's worth pointing out that this goes through the charity sector, this goes through the kwangokasi, it goes through aid agencies. It is both operational domestically and internationally. And it is deeply corrosive of the post-war settlement of the Anglosphere. Because how can we possibly have an institution based on language, common law, and religion when all of these things are held to be contemptible? And how can we maintain, strengthen, and expand? I would want to see this expanded to India. How can we maintain, strengthen, and expand an alliance based on these things when every factor and facet and force of the left is doing what it can to prevent this? And this is what I call the active left versus the complacent right, which I think has been a trend, and I think is only now, over the past 5 years, since President Trump and since Brexit, beginning to change. It is, of course, in Hungary and Poland and Slovakia and the Czech Republic and the Visegrad Four further advanced, and I think there are some aspects of the difference between European conservatism and British and American conservatism that explain this, because it is more culturally attuned, and because our conservatism is more aligned to property than anything else. But I think it's a lesson that we could learn from Central Europe, that the right must be constantly vigilant. We cannot take it as read that simply because our ideas are powerful in and of themselves, they will be listened to, particularly not when in institutions and in the media, these views are suppressed. I'm going to move on now to COVID. Why? Because I think it demonstrates how deeply our resistance has been corroded by the expansion of leftist ideas, by the idea of the state as an infallible protector, and by the dominance of these trains of thought within the media. When the Wuhan virus, as Mr. Abbott quite rightly called it, began to be noticed in the West, there was no suggestion that for 2 years societies would be locked down, people prevented from leaving their homes and transacting business, forced to wear facial coverings while in public transport, shops and restaurants. There was no suggestion that we would follow a Chinese model. That we can see. And yet, as Neil Ferguson has said, not the historian who's speaking later, but the epidemiologist from London, once we saw that Italy and China got away with it, Italy followed, and we knew we could too. These totalitarian instincts are deeply written in the DNA of these people. And yet, what was there from the Conservative Party here, in Britain, from the Republican Party in America, in terms of real concern and immediate fight back? Nothing. Nothing at all. Those public intellectuals, those epidemiologists, those people who spoke out, Lord Sumption, the Supreme Court Justice, Karol Sikora, the great oncologist, who said, this will cause havoc in cancer, in heart disease, in stroke. These people were not only ignored, they were told that they were going to cause deaths. Carl Hennihan, the epidemiologist at the Oxford Centre for Evidence-Based Medicine, had the same experience, despite having sat on one of the committees that advised on this. I myself wrote a piece in the Daily Telegraph of London in May of 2020, in which I suggested that we might step back. We might think about whether these policies were in fact the right way, morally the right way, culturally the right way to go about dealing with this not terribly destructive virus. I cannot tell you the number of comments I had along the lines of, I hope that you or someone you love dies of this. And Jonathan Somerton has told me he had exactly the same thing. And yet we were castigated not only by those on the left who would seek to impose greater state control, we were castigated by our own people. And we were told that what we were doing was irresponsible, immoral, libertarian, which has become now, in Britain at least, and I think in parts of America, one of the greatest slurs you could throw at anyone. We were told that we were putting liberty ahead of safety. Because this is not simply about disease. This is about the expansion of the state under the guise of looking after you. This is now what the Gramscian project has resulted in, is the expansion of the state to such a degree that most people simply have no idea of the danger of it and of the breadth of it. I'll give you a small example that cashless payment is now pretty much taken as read in large parts of the UK. Has anybody thought about the impact of this, not only on the poor who are unbanked and therefore unable to access basic services, but on our ability to be private individuals and transact business as we see fit without the state looking at this? And I know that the idea of a Chinese social credit system is somewhat overdone, but I think that this is one of those instances where you can see it being pushed forward. And to return to the other parts of the Anglosphere, where there is, I'm afraid, a tendency going back farther than in Britain and America for what C.S. Lewis called omnipotent moral busybodies. Again, as Clive James said, Australia, the problem with Australia is not that it is a nation of former convicts, it's a nation of prison warders. There is this idea in New Zealand, Australia, and to some degree Canada, that you should and must protect overwhelmingly. They've not become prison states, but they've become hospital states where you are not considered competent to judge whether or not you are at risk, and you are indeed judged to be a risk to all those around you. And one aspect of this that goes even further, and I think should be a topic for thought and discussion on the right, is the advance of euthanasia laws in Canada under the Medical Assistance in Dying Scheme, a truly abhorrent piece of legislation, which is, I should say, an utter moral failure. And those in the Anglosphere who fail to condemn this are failing to look at what is going to happen next in their own countries. And I will just leave that thought there. So this loss of cultural confidence in the Anglosphere is, I think, one of the truly devastating aspects of geopolitics over the past 50 years. It was G.K. Chesterton who said that when men choose not to believe in God, they do not hereafter believe in nothing. They then become capable of believing in anything. And when all those institutions that teach you how to think and suggest what you might believe have been pushing down a certain path for 50 years, it is no surprise, therefore, that the greater majority of people should not only be inured against leftist thought, but should think that it is normal thought. And to finish, I must, of course, discuss Donald Trump. It would be remiss not to mention him. And I think he is a phenomenon who can directly be described, as Chesterton describes, of men capable of believing in anything when the belief goes. Not in this case in God, but in the power of the Republican Party at its moderate to right wing to win elections and to speak for America. Once that power is lost, because I think of the supine nature of the Republican Party in the face of Obama, you open the way for Trump. And I would leave you with this final thought, that Trump can be defined and explained precisely by the cult of personality. He is a direct analogy in that regard to Joseph Stalin. His triumphs are enumerated and enlarged by him and by his supporters to such a degree that they would appear to be the work of God, whereas his failures are reduced and pushed to one side. There is this idea that whatever Trump does, I should say, this idea maintains among the Republican right who want to see him as president again, but also I think among a great many normal Americans, there is this idea that only Trump can stand up. There is this idea that only he can beat the left. Ladies and gentlemen, to have reached the position where Donald Trump is the hope of the American right, the only intellectual savior of conservatism, is, I should submit, one of the greater failures of the Anglosphere over the past 50 years. And I hope that some of what I've said today will allow people watching this at home and you in the room to do something to make sure that he does not remain that for very long. Thank you.
Thank thank you very much, John and Melissa, for the invitation, and to everyone else who was involved in organizing this excellent event. I just have to take one point of disagreement with the excellent preceding speaker, which is that after spending 12 years at Harvard University, I think 1% is a considerable overestimation of the number of conservative faculty. Not sure where that number came from. I think I knew about 2 conservative faculty at Harvard. No, but seriously, even the statistics bear this out. After the 2020 election, of course, since you can find the public records of political donations online, so people did a study of all of those donors to the political candidates in 2020 who identified themselves as having an employment affiliation with Harvard University. And there were, among the Harvard faculty, almost 300 donors to the Biden campaign for a total of over $300,000. And there were a total of 5 donors to the Trump campaign for a total of $3,000. So it is indeed, a 100-to-1 outsized contrast between those two. Well, I didn't mean to go off on that, but I could talk about it all day. So I just wanted to register my profound disagreement on this on this subject. Well, I've been asked to speak about U.S. world power and American public opinion. I'm not a scholar of American public opinion, but I'm a political scientist and an American. So I guess I'll try to do my best to put forward a few thoughts that came to mind after looking at some of the recent polls and thinking broadly about this trend. Well, let's set that aside and go back to Harvard for a second. The Harvard faculty have also completely changed their approach to foreign policy in the last 20 years, and this will become a theme of the talk too. I was there from 2000 to 2012, 2013. So I remember very well the early days of the Iraq War and the entire period of the Bush presidency. I myself am more of a realism and restraint person, so even at the time I was a bit skeptical of the nature of the American intervention, but to see the Harvard faculty was enough to make one repair wildly to American patriotism by contrast. But of course now that's gotten flipped around as the Harvard faculty now see their Democratic administration as a means of projecting their cultural views through levers of foreign policy. So we'll talk about that as well in a moment. But U.S. world power and the American popular opinion are obviously 2 separate subjects that relate in several different ways. So I think overall, I would say that American popular opinion on American power is a little bit less tied to direct geopolitical concerns than it is in other countries. Maybe that's obvious, but I think it's worth saying. If we were to compare the population of the United States and the population of, say, Poland to, or other countries in Central Europe, to questions of geopolitics that surround the Russian invasion of Ukraine and similar topics, the American public, simply by being far away and very powerful and occupying the better part of a continent and seeing things at somewhat of a distance, doesn't have the same immediate connection to the geopolitical questions that it is asked to address. Rather, I think that the American public is typically reactive, not in a bad way, but reactive and supportive of the general direction of American foreign policy, and only slowly reacts to changes in that situation. And what I mean by saying that the American public is generally supportive of the direction of American foreign policy is that there's always like a bare majority of support for it, or a little bit more. It may come more from the Republican Party this time, more from the Democratic Party that time, or from Americans who identify with one party or the other. But overall, there's a little bit of support overall for the general bearing of American foreign policy and the view that America should be a powerful force in the world. So, setting that aside, what observations can we make? First, over the last 20 years or so, American public opinion took a more of a turn towards skepticism about the degree of U.S. power and the role of U.S. power in the world in the latter years of the War on Terror. So this was something that paved the way for the rise of Trump and his very bold criticism, which I'll get to, of the preceding Republican administrations. So if you look at polls from the early 1990s through the mid-2010s, the American public was asked the question, is the U.S. more or less important and powerful on the world stage than it was 10 years earlier? And there's a big, big shift in those numbers in the late aughts, so around 2008, 2009. If you look at the scores in the 90s and even up until 2004, right after the beginning of the U.S. War on Terror, by and large, there's a good number. Between 35 and 45% of the American population says that the U.S. has become more powerful and more important over the last 10 years. And that really spikes at the beginning of the War on Terror. And then as the War on Terror became something of a quagmire in parts of the world, those numbers sharply reversed. So if you look at polls from 2009 and 2013, instead of 20% of the population thinking that America has become less important over the last 10 years, you start to see numbers like 53% in 2013 think that America has become less important on the world stage. And that's significant because it's precisely the period 2003 to 2013, that was when the confidence of the electorate was driving the political and foreign policy interventions which it later soured on. So those numbers began to change in 2009 and 2013, and that provided the environment for Trump's very striking views. For me, this goes back to the South Carolina presidential debate in 2016. I remember watching it and I was stunned because I lived in South Carolina growing up for 6 years. It's a heavily military state, and working class Republicans are in the military. Everyone has someone in the military in the family, and he absolutely scorched Jeb Bush. And this is, lest this become just a legend in my own mind, I took a glance at the transcript of those remarks, and Trump says this in 2016, quote, "Obviously, the war in Iraq was a big fat mistake, all right? Now you can take it any way you want." And it took Jeb Bush, if you remember at the beginning of his announcement when he announced for president, it took him 5 days. He went back, it was a mistake, it wasn't a mistake. It took him 5 days before his people told him what to say, and ultimately he said it was a mistake. The war in Iraq, we spent $2 trillion, thousands of lives, we don't even have it. Iran has taken over Iraq with the second largest oil reserves in the world. Obviously, it was a mistake. George Bush made a mistake. We can make mistakes, but that one was a beauty. We should never have been in Iraq. We have destabilized the Middle East. And then one of the other candidates started talking, and Jeb Bush had to edge back in. And so Jeb Bush's response to this was, quote, "I think it's my turn now, isn't it?" So it was just absolutely just a devastating interaction. So there was this moment, I think, that was partly not realized, and this is not a perfect way of describing it, but we don't have all day. This led to a certain reevaluation of American foreign policy by a lot of conservatives. But to make a long story short, this moment that Trump began has broadly on the right yielded to or prepared the following kind of argument. You could see two ways that this could go. One would be the U.S. in general should be much, much more restrained on the international stage and not go about making getting deeply involved in conflicts that it can't really win, like it did in Iraq and Afghanistan with with insufficient result, although there haven't been terrorist attacks in America in 20 years, so that's at least one result. And the second type of argument is America has been distracted over the last 20 years with an excessively idealistic desire to project its power. We need to be more realistic. That's why we need to go to war over Taiwan today. That's the second very strange way that this argument or this skepticism about the policies of the early 2000s can go in either of those directions, and it's starting to go more in that one. Look how bad the withdrawal from Afghanistan happened. What did we get out of this mess? Nothing. Instead, we have what has happened in the past 20 years. We've now given rise to a stronger Russia and a stronger China. We need to focus on those militarily. So it's a kind of realism argument, but it's not a restraint argument. And that is becoming more prominent on the right, and people are slowly starting to adopt this. If you look at the polls from this year about how Americans see tensions between China and Taiwan, for the first time, the number of Americans who consider tensions between China and Taiwan to be very serious is 35%. It's usually been like 10% or something like that. So there are more people that are paying attention to this. But what interests me in this poll is that they asked people about different aspects of China. Which are the ones you consider to be somewhat serious issues? Which are the ones you consider to be very serious issues? And the single issue that people considered to be most serious, with 62% of respondents saying that it's a very serious question, is the partnership between China and Russia. So that's very interesting. There's, I'll comment on it in a second, but there's also a considerable breakdown in these numbers by age. It's primarily older Americans who are seriously interested in this issue. So around half of people aged 65 and older described tensions between China and Taiwan as a very serious problem. Only 25% of those in their 20s considered the same. So it's almost as though this almost tracks with what I was saying about the refocusing of the projection of American power. That older population were the same people who were strongly in favor of U.S. military intervention 20 years ago. Now they're a little bit older, and they're still in favor of that, but they're refocusing a little bit. So the younger generation is a little bit less concerned by this. I do think it indicates that people are concerned about multipolarity and the overall role and place of U.S. in the world. If Americans can identify the fact that China and Russia are growing closer together, we can dispute all afternoon about what the causes of that are. Maybe it has to do with the sanctions policy driving them closer together. Maybe it was going to happen anyway. We could dispute about that all afternoon. But it's clear that Americans recognize this as an issue. So 2 points to conclude, or 2 final areas to comment on. First of all, what is the current state of American public opinion on the foreign policy questions that are facing us now? And second, how is this playing out on a larger scale? How will this play out in the next couple of years? Well, the only poll that I have seen from after the elections was made by the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation. I'm not sure if that means that it's a super objective pollster, or if they tend to, poll for pro-Reagan views. I'm not sure, but between November 9th and 17th, they asked people, 57% of respondents said the U.S. must continue to support Ukraine. This is interesting to me because there was a lot of talk before the election that Americans were becoming very dissatisfied with this. If you listen to right-wing radio, which I do all the time, then they were saying, well, Americans are upset at spending money on this conflict abroad when we can't even secure our border at home. Well, 57% seem to support this. So fortunately or unfortunately, whatever your view is on the matter, it seems that there's general support for that, and that shows in the election results. Foreign policy isn't usually a big issue during the midterm elections. It wasn't this year, certainly not enough to bring people to vote in a different way from 2020. They basically voted it the same way in 2022 that they voted in 2020. 33% said America should focus on its internal problems and avoid provoking Russia. My favorite result, the U.S. has sent more than $19 billion in military aid to the Ukraine this year. 39% of Americans, after thoughtful reflection, said that this is the right amount of money. Not sure what that means, but so about half of the public, though, now says that the U.S. will say that the U.S. is doing too much to help solve world problems if you ask them that generally. But again, if you ask them that issue by issue, they're going to favor the current foreign policy consensus. What's interesting, and this is the point on which I will rest at the end, is that Democrats are now far more likely than Republicans to say that the U.S. should be active in world affairs. Obviously, that's a big shift from 20 years ago. So 60% of Democrats say that it is best for the future of our country to be active in world affairs, and 65% of Republicans say we should pay less attention to problems overseas and concentrate on problems here at home. This is concerning to me for the following reason. A lot of people have talked about this, that American foreign policy is now tied in some ways to the projection of a particular cultural view, that American foreign policy has become more aggressively culturally liberal and lefty. Can see that in the actions of some of the American embassies around the world. Certainly true here. And a good test case, though, is how the American foreign policy establishment reacted to Bolsonaro's loss in the Brazilian election and the election of Lula. And basically their take was, well, Bolsonaro is like a bad reactionary cultural person, and Lula is like a hip progressive leftist. So we should support Lula. Never mind that Lula has been like a long opponent of American influence in Latin America. So it seems like we're willing to, trade away the Monroe Doctrine of American influence in Latin America in favor of cultural hegemony, even though it leads to elections of candidates who are hostile to us. So I think that goes back to the point I made at the beginning, that Americans are sometimes removed from the core geopolitical concerns in evaluating stuff. It's even true for Republicans 20 years ago. They were in favor of intervention because of the flag, and now Democrats are in favor of military intervention because of other flags, and that's where we are. So that's my overview. I think it's a little bit concerning to see how that will play out, because it could lead to the U.S. undermining its own interests in favor of this cultural agenda. I think sometimes the cultural agenda ends up cutting America off from its true sources of strength, which are ultimately those that are needed to sustain reasonable alliances over the long term. So thanks.
And our next guest, which is the first of two virtual guests, is Karlyn Bowman, this Distinguished Senior Fellow Emeritus at the American Enterprise Institute, who I believe should be coming up on the screen now.
Thank you very much. I, too, would like to thank John and Melissa O'Sullivan for inviting me to participate in this forum, and I've really enjoyed the remarks we've heard thus far. Professor Pappin, I think, has laid out an excellent summary of Americans' views about their role in the world, and particularly interesting is the reversal of Democratic and Republican attitudes in recent years driven by deep partisan polarization. Americans have long been reluctant internationalists, aware that we must play a global role, inattentive to foreign affairs, and generally, as Professor Pappin said, willing to follow along with the current administration. But I think we saw some interesting changes in the Trump years. But that's not my topic today. I just wanted to compliment the presentation that he gave. Instead, I'm going to be talking about how Americans view the American brand, about domestic views of America overall. In the minds of most Americans, the American brand is tarnished, but there is still a significant luster to the brand. Pollsters have asked for a number of years about whether Americans see their country as a great country, like many of the others, or is it worse than the others? And we've seen some significant changes in opinions on this question over the last 50 years. Today, Americans say that their country is a great country along with others. A bare majority in a recent Pew Research survey gave this response. 23% chose the response that the U.S. stands above all other countries, and an identical 23% said that other countries are better than the United States. We tend to look to the views of the young to get an indication of where America is heading. And in this new Pew poll, 4 in 10 young Americans said that other countries are better than the United States. Americans were much more confident of their standing 50 years ago. When the Pearson Institution asked a more specific question in a poll in September about 4 different areas, plurality said that the U.S. was a great country along with many others in terms of racial and ethnic groups, women, religious minorities, and LGBTQ people. But for each of these categories, a third to nearly 40% said that other countries were better than the United States. Yet another poll finding indicates that Americans have less confidence in the brand. A lot of this, of course, is magnified by the relentless negativity of the American media, which is largely dominated by a liberal elite. In another question, Pew found that only 19% of Americans said that the U.S. democracy was a good model for other countries to embrace, but 72% said that that was once the case and is no longer so. In a companion 16-country survey, the median response was also that our democracy was once a great model. In another survey, equal proportions, around 4 in 10, said that our political system needs to be completely reformed or that major changes need to be made. Yet another indicator of how Americans see the question of the American brand asks people how proud they are to be an American, and the proportion saying that they are extremely proud to be an American reached a record low in Gallup's data in 2022. Still, around 2/3 overall said that they were extremely or very proud, but that response too has been falling. But there are many things that Americans are proud of, and we see these in many surveys overall: our scientific achievements, our military, our educational and university system, and our culture, arts, and entertainment. Survey data suggests that Americans' own views of what the American brand should be may be changing, at least in terms of our foreign policy goals. Americans appear to have broadened the definition of that role, as Professor Pappin suggested. For decades, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs has asked people about top foreign policy goals for the United States. The responses would be familiar to all of you: protecting the jobs of American workers, dealing with the nuclear threat, maintaining a strong and robust defense. Dealing with climate change was added to that list a decade ago. But the Pearson poll suggests another new area. 43% said an essential foreign policy goal for the United States was to prevent discrimination against women and minority groups around the world, and another 39% said that this was important but not essential. So the perspective for these laudable, albeit abstract goals is global in a way that it was not before. Perhaps another indicator of how we see ourselves comes from a question about our standing in the world. In the September Pearson poll, 23% said the U.S. standing in the world was better than it was in the past 2 years, and 39% said it was worse. When this question was asked in 2018 and 2019 during the Trump presidency, 48 and 53% respectively said that the U.S. standing was worse. So there's clearly been some recovery here. The events of January 6 had a significant impact on U.S. public opinions. Americans of both left and right, Democrat and Republican, for different reasons, are worried about the health of our democracy. When you care deeply about something, as Americans do about our democracy, you worry about threats to it. In the exit poll of voters leaving the polls in our elections last month, 68% of voters said that democracy in the U.S. was either somewhat or very threatened. The events of January 6 have resonated substantially. Many people were surprised when Joe Biden made the defense of democracy a major theme in our off-year elections and 2 speeches toward the close of the campaign. People weren't sure it would have much effect, but some say it seemed to have worked, as candidates who believed the 2020 election was not legitimate were defeated across the country. And what's more, the election was a normal election. We have 10,000 voting jurisdictions in the United States, and there were very few problems with election administration in any of them. In a new poll that Pew released yesterday, strong majorities said election administration was conducted well in their own jurisdictions. And what's more, most Americans believed that their own vote had been counted accurately, according to the exit poll and also to this new Pew poll. Interestingly, Republicans were much more optimistic about this than they were 2 years ago. GOP and MAGA candidates conceded, and many Americans believe there at least been somewhat of a return to normal. I've gone through a litany of bad news about the American brand, so I'll end on a note of optimism. Americans are deeply dissatisfied with the way things are going in our country, but large majorities in several polls, both Democrats and Republicans, have confidence in the future of the U.S. I was reminded of this when the Italian journalist asked the American soccer team captain this week about discrimination in the U.S. and discrimination that he had faced. And he responded by saying there's a lot of discrimination everywhere, and we're making progress every day in the United States. I think that's an indication of the kind of resilience of the American brand, despite all of the problems that we have now. Thank you.
First of all, I would like to express my thanks to John and Melissa inviting me. And I would like to express my congratulations that you created a very challenging intellectual atmosphere here on the main issues of the international politics. I am inviting you, ladies and gentlemen, for an excursion to Central Asia. I am representing the Organization of Turkic States. It is an intergovernmental organization which was established in 2009. Turkey, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan are the member states, and Hungary from 2018 we are an observer. And the Organization of Turkic States has an embassy in Budapest, and I have represented the Organization of Turkic States with my colleagues who are sitting among you. And the main points was coming, which was a main issue in this conference, that the geography and the geopolitics is gaining a higher appreciation recently. That it was yesterday Professor Furedi talked about the negligence of the geography. He was right. It was a certain way. It was right. And you know, all these books, there are published a lot of books, the importance of the geography and connected the geography connected issue in security policy, military conflicts, connectivity, transport, and other issues. That my topic is Central Asia. So you could see the map of Central Asia, which became an independent geopolitical factor after the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. And this huge region has a 30 years independent past. They could have sovereign relations even with Russia, the big brother, The surface is a huge one, mostly because of Kazakhstan, which is a huge country, is a 4 million square kilometer. The population recently is a 73 million. It will be 100 million to the 2060. The GPT per capita is not a very high because of the various issues that is different in a certain country. The average is 6,000 American dollars. And the political geography is a very important subject. That it is about the mountains and the rivers. The rivers of the plains mostly originate in the mountains, the very high mountains, and the rivers can be controlled by the mountains. And that's why who would like to have a political control in the region, they should conquest the most important points. And to show you what I am thinking, that I would like to talk about you the Tibetan Plateau. The Tibetan Plateau is a key geographical region of Eastern on Southeastern Asia, because all the rivers are originated. The important river, the Yangtze, is originated from Tibet, and China should control Tibet in order to have a proper life in the country. The other rivers that are important in this region are coming from Tibet, and that's why when the communist Chinese occupied Tibet, it was not only a political issue, it was a geopolitical act, and they created they created China to be geopolitically very strong in her region. Central Asia, that you could see there's the ethnicities. It is a very divergent because the borders are a certain way in the southern part. They are the imprint of the Russian-British great game from the end of the 19th century. And the eastern border with China, it is the imprint of the Soviet-Chinese relations in the 1930s and the 40s. If you see the nation borders and the Central Asian border, there are no natural geographic border, no linguistic border, because there's a people, that's the other side of the borders, they are speaking the same languages in many cases, no civilization border. That it is an interesting figure. It is an imprint of the past. No, but Central Asia is a very complicated region. If you start to read British Encyclopedia, you could see the Central Asia, even from the beginning of the 20th century, the Central Asia was a huge region that it was always discussed, but not that Central Asia, what we have, the post-Soviet Central Asia, because the Central Asias are the certain western part of a huge civilization, which history was interconnected. In most of cases that the historians, they used to show Central Asia, that's the actual political Central Asia, larger Central Asia, together with Afghanistan, Iran, and used to say inner Asia. But inner Asia, Central Asia, and inner Asia. And it was originally in the political thinking, 50, 100 those Central Asia, it was a Russian Central Asia. And it is actually very, that we are not calling it actually as Central Asia. we are calling we are talking Central Asia and Inner Asia. In Asia, mostly the part of China, Mongolia, and some Siberian territories. Dennis Steiner is a famous scholar from the Indiana University, originated, of course, from Budapest, and he's a great scholar in the Oriental Studies, that he created in the Indiana University a huge Eurasian Studies Center and Altaic Center, and he and his students, they created this map, and Professor Shinor wanted to create, he liked to create new words, and Shinor called it as it is the Central Eurasia. And following the topic that if you see this map, you should see there is a line between the two regions. This line is a gate of Jungaria, and it is a geographical map from this point that between Inner Asia and Central Asia. So we have this, between the Tian Shan and the Altai Mountains, there is a pass. It is a huge valley. It is 100 kilometers wide. It is a gate of Jungaria, and it is the history place that Inner Asia and Central Asia were connected, but it used to be the Inner Asians invaded Central Asia from east. There was a Turks, the Mongolians, and even the Chinese. The Chinese came into Central Asia by the gate of Jungaria. And this actually, there's the border of Kazakhstan, China, and Russia. It is somewhere here. Kyrgyz, it is a great crossing point between Kazakhstan and China, is in this region. That why is it important for the Central Asians? Because the roots of the Turks are from Inner Asia. There's the ancient home, Asena is in somewhere in, this is the Ötüken mountains in Mongolia, and the Turks came to Central Asia through the gate of Jungaria. And that's to deal with the Inner Asia, Central Asia should be studied together. There is an international conference, the Permanent Inter-Altai Conference, the PIAC, that founded by famous professor, including Dennis Steiner. And Hungary is very connected. The last conference was in Budapest and hosted in our headquarters in this summer. That the Turkologists, the Mongolists, the Sinologists know that the ancient homes of the Turks are in Inner Asia, and they migrated to Central Asia between the 4th and the 7th, 8th century because various political reasons. The first Turkic empire was a Euro-Asian empire because it is Mongolia, Xinjiang, and it is Central Asia. It was a Göktürk empire which existed 200 years. It was the first great Turkic state, which was destroyed. This was destroyed from west by the Abbasid caliphs, the Arabs, and it was destroyed, by the way, from east by the Tang dynasty, by China. But to understand Central Asia, you should know that the roots of the Central Asians are somewhere in Inner Asia, the actual China, Mongolia, and Siberia. That, you know, that the Soviet system, that these countries belong to the Tsarist Russia, and later the Soviet Union, the Soviet system brought a great economic changes with structural destruction. So something good, something wrong. Achieved a certain technical, technological, and educational modernism, which had a local interest on very few issues. What was the role of Central Asia in the imperial politics of St. Petersburg or Moscow? I tried to collect the points from the Tsarist Russian view and the Soviet point of view. Of course, this huge area was very important to defense Russia proper from the British in the Great Game and the Americans in later. And it was a very important space to go to the Indian Ocean, as the Tsars tried to go to India, and Leonid Brezhnev also we tried to do it, but he failed. That it was during the Second World War, Central Asia was a very important hinterland of the Soviet Union to protect the country. It was a very important place to have a safe haven for the Soviet rocket and space programs. And of course, it was very important, the population, the Central Asians, they were the soldiers of the Tsarist Russian army, they were the soldiers of the Soviet army. It was a huge, they have a huge contribution to the Russian and the Soviet power. And economic issues, that it is the certain colonization but it was important in the transportation that to have a proper connection between Siberia and Russia proper, that the Ural, the Central Asia, mostly Kazakhstan, was supply the Ural industrial region with iron, coal, and everything. The Uzbek cotton was defining the raw material of the Soviet textile industry. The hydrocarbon reserves of the Central Asia were integrated into the Soviet oil and gas pipeline system, and with the Kazakh and the Uzbek uranium, supplying Russia and all the northern areas with food, mainly wheat, vegetables, fruits, safe market for the Tsarist Russian and the Soviet economy. And very important issue we do not talk too much about. The brain drain through the university studies. Talented young people in Moscow and in Leningrad, they have a career, they never return to their home. And providing well-paying senior jobs to reliable Soviet comrades in the specific rotation in Central Asia and somewhere. And most important, the last point, the inculcation of Soviet imperial consciousness through the suppression of the natural cultures and national languages. That Central Asia was a certain place of the Tsarist Russian colonization and Soviet ideological colonization. It is interesting, the Russians, they could sell it. Otto von Bismarck, he was a great supporter of the Russian penetration into Central Asia. He told that that's not because it was a certain interest of Germany. He told that they really believed the Tsarist Russia will bring civilization into Central Asia. And Arthur Koestler, who visited Central Asia in 1936, he was a great admirer of the Soviet results, but later he changed his mind, and the darkest in noon in the 1940, he confessed the reality that Central Asia was a place of the certain Soviet-type slavery. That after 1991, the Central Asia started a new path that they have a functional national. Oh, so thank you. They were able to build up functional national structures. They entered the Soviet no ownership. They created private ownership, And of course, Russia wanted to keep these countries together, and the CIS was constructed in the last hours of the collapse of the Soviet Union, and these countries, except Turkmenistan, they are the members, and there's a military cooperation. It is the Collective Security Treaty Organization, and Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan are the members. That, of course, there are other corporations, and there are Euro-Asian corporations, which is well known, the Shanghai Corporation. But it is not. It is a very political, not a very. I think is not a very concrete. That, of course, China is an important player in Central Asia not because of only the geography. China needs the reserves of Central Asia, and you know it well. The Chinese government started the One Road, One Belt program, which is very crucial to develop Western China. And one of the main roads from Western China to Europe is going through Central Asia to Russia, or to the Caspian Sea, to Turkey, and to Europe. The United States of America is a very important player. Chevron is owner of many oil and gas fields in Kazakhstan, mostly in Tengiz. It is a certain issue that Tengiz, the first Tengiz refinery was made by Hungarians, and the Hungarians sold to the Americans in the mid-90s. And for the Kazakhstan, the American connection are very important. And the European Union started to discover Central Asia. There is a new approach which started a few years ago, when the European Union made a new Central Asian strategy, and started to institutionalize the connection. The enhanced partnership and cooperation agreement was signed with Kazakhstan, and it will be signed very soon with Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan. Turkmenistan is not very interested in, and Tajikistan is now in the map of the European Union. That you could see this photograph. Charles Michel met the Central Asian presidents 2020. It was a very important visit, and there are the continuation that's the Central Asian presidents like to visit certain European capitals. Recently, the new elected president of Kazakhstan, Tokayev, visited Paris, and he made some contract with French companies to invest in Kazakhstan in the gas industry. And Mirziyoyev, the Uzbek president, did it a few months ago also. That the effects of the Russian-Ukrainian war in Central Asia, that Russia found itself that's because of this war, the Russian influence in Central Asia diminished, but Russia expressed loyalty from the Central Asian states, but not military or economic support. As a result of the war, the transport routes through Russia to the west were more or less closed, and it has a huge impact on China, but in the Central Asian countries also. These roads were very important for China. They are closed, and there is the only way the transportation for the Central Asians and the Chinese using the Caspian, Caucasus, Turkey corridor, which became very important, actually. That is the greatest port of Alat, near to Baku. It is a very, very modern port, and it is the gateway from east, from from Central Asia and the Caspian Sea towards Europe, railway connection through Georgia to Turkey. This corridor is functioning well. This port is unbelievable, modern, and it is perfect. But the problem, the railway capacity that the gauge, there's a railway gauge in Azerbaijan and Georgia is a Russian type gauge, and they should change all the wagons at the Georgian-Turkish border. And that's why the capacity, we have a huge capacity in Alat, but the transportation possibilities towards using the railway is not enough. That Hungary is an observer country in the Organization of Turkic States. We had the last summit in Samarkand. You could see the presidents of the Central Asian and the Azerbaijan and Turkey. That's the Turkic states and the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán. Thank you very much for your attention.
This is a long panel, so I'll try to see if I can keep you all awake. There have been several world orders in the last 2 centuries. For the century before 1914, there was a Britain-led Eurocentric world order based on a balance of powers termed the Concert of Europe, and it was originally designed to counter French hegemony, but after 1870, it changed into trying to counter German hegemony, and in general, it was rather successful. It collapsed with the First World War, and actually wasn't restored, but rather within a generation, by the end of the Second World War, Europe had destroyed its own world predominance. So, since WW2, there have been 2 additional world orders. The first one was between 1945 and 1990, and it was predicated around the support or opposition to the spread of communist regimes. And it resulted in a balance between 2 blocks of nations gathered around 2 respective superpowers, the USA and the USSR, who had between them the capability of destroying each other and much of the world. So this mutual assured destruction or MAD option overall contributed to a balance which persisted overall until the rather sudden internal collapse of communism in Europe in 1990. And this collapse ushered the second post-World War II world order, which was described by President George Herbert Bush, Bush the father, in several speeches between 1990 and 1991 explicitly. So this is, I think, the first time he used this description was in the speech where he said, the end of the Cold War has been a victory for all humanity. Europe has become whole and free, and America's leadership was instrumental in this. The world can therefore seize this opportunity to fulfill the long-held promise of a new world order, where brutality will go unrewarded and aggression will meet collective resistance. So this order was based basically on a unipolar world where there was a clear American superiority in all fields, promising stability and prosperity, and it was predicated on the defense of existing borders, on growing international trade, and on the expectation that economic development will eventually lead all countries to become liberal democratic regimes. So this brings us to now. However, as we all know, this new world order is collapsing before our eyes. And it is collapsing because of its 2 main pillars are being increasingly shattering. On the one hand, we have the victory of the market economy and globalist trade, apparently, but it did not usher an unavoidable transition to democracy. Instead, we are witnessing the actual dwindling of many democracies, from Russia to the Central Asian republics, but especially we have discovered that in many cases, and particularly in China, this new market economic order is handing dictatorships economic and manufacturing resources that are unprecedented since the Second World War. So on the economic side, this new world order hasn't actually delivered what was expected. On the other hand, there are serious cracks appearing in the structure of the American colossus. Still, it is the largest and strongest economy in the world, as well as it exerts a significant cultural influence or maybe hegemony. However, the US now faces several internal problems, among them an addiction to debt that has reached gigantic proportions, the crumbling of its industrial base, and the clear overextension of its military commitments, with an estimated, I think, over 800 bases in 80 countries. It's hard to think of a country where the US isn't present, more or less. Perhaps worst of all, this appears to be bringing about a cultural crisis of purpose in America. So I believe that these developments have made it quite clear to all those who would look at things that the current world order is unsustainable. The results are already visible in various areas, from Ukraine to Taiwan. It has systems that have been propped by American might are being increasingly challenged. I believe that 20 years ago, maybe even 10 years ago, Russia wouldn't have invaded Ukraine, not expecting to be punished for it. And never mind what happens after the invasion, but the invasion itself was an expression of a vision that the US would be curtailed in what it would do, and the same seems to be true with the rising, I would say, the rising danger to Taiwan, and obviously this will only get worse if it's not challenged. So we can, and I think that we should, hope that the USA recovers from its current internal predicaments earlier rather than later. But history does not stand still, and the balance of power is already shifting around the world. And in any event, I think that it is completely unrealistic to expect that America will recover its absolute predominance that existed in the 1990s and that was a result of very specific circumstances. It is therefore useless to expect the current world order to magically persist, and we should look beyond it. So what are the alternatives? One alternative is that Washington will, as I said, it's still the strongest economy and military power in the world, but it decide to retreat to some version of, let's call it Fortress America, perhaps some version of a renewed Monroe Doctrine saying, this area of North America, maybe South America, is our purpose, and what goes elsewhere, we don't really care about it. So I believe that this doesn't look very much in America's interest in the short term, because it would cost America much of its current prosperity, as the world economy is rather interconnected. And in the long term, there's nothing to ensure that a rising China, unopposed by America, will not eventually send tentacles into the American continent too. This is one possibility. Another possibility is for Washington to try and continue with some version of the current world order, as if nothing has really changed. And this seems pretty much what the current US administration is attempting. But I think that this route is becoming gradually unviable, as many around the world are noticing the growing disparity between Washington's posturing and the actual retreat from Afghanistan, the clear reluctance for any direct involvement in Ukraine, and the rising doubts about its capability to defend Taiwan. So I would like to propose a third option, one that was sometimes put forward in the past, but not very consistently or convincingly as long as the old world order seems to be working. So if it wasn't broken, why change it? But now it appears to be broken, so let's think about it. I think it would be described as an alliance of democracies, but a better description would be a system of regional defensive alliances of democracies, in which the US will still play an important part, but it will be a far more restrained role than in the past, so that it will not be expected to remain the main supplier of military economic resources, let alone troops. In what would such a system of regional alliances of democracies differ from the existing system that the US has created around the world, from NATO to its alliances in the Pacific and so on? So I believe that this new system should be different in two crucial factors. One, the new system would function as on a regional basis and require allies in each region to bear most of the burden themselves, in military as well as economic terms, with the US supplying backing, technology, as well as some military and diplomatic assistance, but not be expected to be directly involved in every conflict. The second crucial factor is that the new system will allow in only democracies and not be open to any that would join it. It would also be defensive in nature and not intended to actively spread democracy or affect regime change around the world. These two principles would present a significant shift from the current system of American alliances. Those current alliances are predicated on the US supplying not only the vast majority of boots on the ground troops, armaments and strategic leadership, but also on including within the alliances some countries with very problematic regimes like Pakistan or Turkey, to which I will return. Why do I think that such a system would be preferable to the current one? Because I believe it rests on better practical as well as moral principles than the current system, in which America is supposed to bail out everyone else. And so this system today encourages passivity and dependency on its allies. So I believe it's not only bad for America, it's also bad for its allies. So my belief is that a nation bears the primary responsibility for its own defense. That is the reason why nation states exist to begin with. So this means that Americans can be expected to contribute men, arms, and funds to any nation that is unwilling to itself put those things forward. The situation in which the US extended it is a defensive umbrella over European countries that would not even meet a minimal commitment of 2% of GDP going toward defense budget was bad, of course, for America, but it was also bad for the Europeans, because it nurtured what I would define as spoiled and opportunistic mindset, in which people think that someone else is going to fight and pay for the wars. So I think that the conflict in Ukraine has woken many Europeans to the errors of this way of thinking, but it's not enough. A wider reassessment is needed. But why am I stressing that the alliances I'm proposing should be open only to democracies? And this is because I argue that countries who are not democratic make eminently unreliable allies and also entangle their allies in a web of contradictions. We may bring as examples the two countries I already mentioned, which are at best quasi-democracies, which are, I see, playing the US. Pakistan, who used to be an American ally against communism, but since the end of the Cold War has been consistently unreliable in the war against Islamism, as well as against China. Turkey, an old NATO partner, is clearly following its own interest, often to the detriment of US ones, from its refusal to seriously engage against Islamist groups, including ISIS and Al-Qaeda, while actively supporting some other Islamist terrorist organizations like Hamas. And it also regularly practices diplomatic blackmail against its supposed allies, for instance, against the countries of the EU regarding refugees, and against NATO concerning the possible admission of Sweden or Finland to the alliance. So, if the ambiguous position of such countries like Pakistan and Turkey towards America's enemies is not enough, the alliance with such countries is also damaging to the capability of establishing alliances with other, possibly more suitable partners. For example, I think that a real strategic alliance with India is impossible as long as the US is aligned to a degree with Pakistan, because those two countries have basic differences of interests. While at the same time, the US cooperation with the various Kurdish entities and militias in Iraq and Syria that have been the most reliable American allies in those areas is being constantly undermined by Turkish attacks on the Kurds. So I propose that an alliance of democratic nations is worthwhile because it supplies a clear principle of association and action. For one, it would make clear that such alliances are based on some commonality of values, which is necessary to gain the support of public opinion, both in the US and in the other allies, for the sacrifices that such alliances sometimes require. It also sends, I believe, an implicit but clear message to the populations of countries, those countries themselves, but also other countries from Iran to China, that any quarrel that the US and its allies have is with the governments and not the peoples of those countries. So something like what I am describing is already emerging, although not in the content of a general structure. One example was mentioned by Prime Minister Abbott before, is the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, better known as the Quad, a regional alliance in East Asia and South Asia of the US with Japan, India, and Australia. This alliance is obviously formed as a strategic partnership to contain China, but it draws its real strength from the fact that these countries are established democracies and the expectation that all four, and not only the US, will invest significant resources in the alliance, including, if it comes to that, boots on the ground. Or in this case, probably it's more boats on the sea, but anyway. If, say, Vietnam would have joined as a member, I believe that the nature of the alliance would change drastically, because the basic principle of cooperation would be only military defense and not any commonality of values or ideas. Indeed, as I said, I believe that as long as the US retains its current close strategic partnership with Pakistan, there is a fundamental threat to the long-term existence of the Quad, since, as could be seen, for example, from the Indian stance towards the Russia-Ukraine war. The Indians are saying, if someone wants to hear what they are saying, America is playing both sides, between us and Pakistan, saying, maybe they're right, we're working with both. So India says, we can also do that. We can say, maybe Russia is right, maybe America, we can work with both. So if America wants to play both sides, it shouldn't be angry at another country that does the same. My belief is that if America chooses one side, and in this case I'm clearly thinking of India, then India can also choose to be clearly on one side of this division. So such alliances can emerge elsewhere. If, for example, some European countries regard the current stance of NATO or the EU against Russia as too weak, they might set up a new alliance, a closer one, together with the US, that is committed to give more resources to opposing Russian expansion. After all, if we consider, for example, that just as 4 members of the Visegrad Group have a combined population of 64 million people and a GDP that is more than 75 of Russia's, then the strategic question is whether such countries are willing to allocate the manpower and economic resources needed to create a real deterrent towards Russia. They would then come to the table as allies of the kind that the US would want, strong partners who are willing to defend themselves and want an alliance with America. This is also the case with another American ally, Israel, that receives American support, but has nevertheless always insisted its own soldiers will fight its wars. Moreover, with time, Israel has also become a partner and supplier of new military technology that it developed for itself, but is also supplying it to the US and other allies, including its recent developed light shields, laser ray weapons that are set to revolutionize several aspects of the future battlefield. So, in my view, such a world order based on regional alliances of democratic nations that are primarily self-reliant and defensive would significantly reduce America's security burden and free resources that it needs to maintain Western technological superiority and its conflict, or at least its situation against China. In this scenario, American assistance to its allies becomes a far more balanced affair, essentially helping those who help themselves and making it possible for American military intervention to become the exception rather than the rule. Thank you.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, it is the penultimate talk of the night. We're about to hear from Professor Niall Ferguson, and please stay around after that for our final talk by Executive Director Istvan Kis. Thank you.
To be with you and to participate in this discussion, even if I have to do it virtually and on a recording rather than live. I want to talk about the situation of the United States in the international system by using an historical analogy, and the analogy is with the Cold War. I'd argue that we are in Cold War II and have been for some time. I'd say that Cold War II began perhaps in 2018, if not before. And if you don't believe me, then I suggest you ask Henry Kissinger, who's old enough at 99 to remember very clearly the first Cold War. I interviewed Kissinger in Beijing back in November 2019, and I asked him if he thought we were in a new Cold War, and he replied, we're in the foothills of a Cold War. And a year later, he upgraded that to the mountain passes of a Cold War. My view is that if Henry Kissinger thinks you're in a Cold War, you probably are in one. It's also worth thinking about Cold War II in the context of Graham Allison's idea of a Thucydides trap. The Thucydides trap is the idea in his book Destined for War. And Allison argues that the United States and China risk falling into that trap. But in the book, if you read it carefully, it's clear that the Cold War is one of the exceptions that proves the rule being that a rising power and an incumbent power will tend to go to war. Allison makes it clear that Cold War I is one of the exceptions because the United States and the Soviet Union did not go to war. One interesting feature of Cold War II is that economic interdependence didn't avert it. Unlike the United States and the Soviet Union, the United States and the People's Republic of China are deeply intertwined economically, and yet that did not prevent an escalation of geopolitical tensions to the point of Cold War. Chimerica was a word I coined back in 2007 to describe the almost symbiotic relationship between the two economies. Well, Chimerica is dead, and it didn't prevent the drift or march, perhaps, to Cold War. I say it's dead because its spirit seems dead, but it's not dead practically. There's still considerable cross-border investment, particularly from the United States to China. But compared with, say, 2007, when I first used the term Chimerica, that economic interdependence is clearly declining, and it's not too much to talk about an ongoing process of decoupling. One argument that I remember making back in 2007 was that Chimerica was in fact an unsustainable relationship. It was in fact a chimera. The whole word Chimerica was a pun on the word chimera. And the problem was that the payoffs of Chimerica were asymmetrical. China benefited considerably more than the United States from the symbiosis. And that expressed itself, for example, in the deindustrialization of the American heartland. And that was why I remember expecting a protectionist backlash at some point. It took until 2016 for that to manifest itself. But that's why I think it was possible to go quite quickly from Chimerica to Cold War II. When you use an analogy like the Cold War, you're implying certain structural resemblances. The way I think about this is that if it looks like a duck, swims like a duck, and quacks like a duck, then it probably is a duck. And this looks like a Cold War. It's ideological, it's technological, it's economic, it's geopolitical. It's not identical to Cold War I, but World War II wasn't identical to World War I. There are a number of important differences. Economically, China's a far more formidable rival than the Soviet Union was. On a purchasing power parity basis, China's GDP is already greater than that of the United States, has been since 2014. The Soviet Union never got closer than about 41% the size of the United States economy. What's interesting is the way in which the COVID-19 pandemic revealed Cold War II to many people who had previously been somewhat skeptical about the idea. When I first talked about Cold War II in 2018, there was a good deal of pushback. Now I think it's a lot clearer to people who were then skeptical that they are dealing with a totalitarian regime, that the Chinese Communist Party does rule China with an iron fist, and that it has a lot of things in common with the mid-20th century totalitarian regimes, including, of course, the Soviet Union. COVID-19 is part of the reason, but only part of the reason, that sentiment towards China has soured in recent years. There's been a really dramatic increase in negative views of China, not only in the United States, but in many other countries. The research that Pew does on this is pretty clear. You have a big increase in unfavorable, in the share of Americans with an unfavorable view of China, going from something around 40% as recently as 2014 to up in the 80% plus region today. You can see the same thing in South Korea. You can see it in Japan. You can see it in Australia. In fact, you see it almost everywhere where Pew does surveys. The United States is not an outlier, and there are relatively few countries, Italy's one, Greece is another, where there hasn't been a big increase in anti-Chinese sentiment. Even issues that didn't used to be a part of what I'm calling Cold War II now clearly are. A good one is climate change. It's becoming a Cold War issue because such a large part of the increase in global emissions of carbon dioxide or global coal consumption is accounted for by China. China is responsible for 64% of the 32% increase in global carbon dioxide emissions since Greta Thunberg was born in 2003, and 93% of the 39% increase in coal consumption. This year, the war in Ukraine has in many ways jolted the Western alliance, the transatlantic alliance, back into life. You could say that Putin's invasion of Ukraine has inspired a kind of leadership masterclass from the Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky. And some friends of mine, I think of Francis Fukuyama here at Stanford, are inclined to see a parallel with the events of 1989. I'm not so sure about that analogy, which strikes me as perhaps over-optimistic. In economic terms, the war in Ukraine's a bit more like 1973, except that it's clearly lasted much longer than the Yom Kippur War when the Arab countries attacked Israel. Its economic consequences, though, are very similar. There's been a spike in global food and energy prices, just as there was in 1973. And in that sense, one can see the war in Ukraine as part of a Cold War narrative, because the thing about Cold Wars is that they're hot in places. The other possible analogy is actually with an earlier conflict, the Korean War, which broke out in 1950. And in some ways, I think that's a better analogy. If you think about Cold War I, it wasn't immediately obvious to many Americans when George Orwell or Winston Churchill talked about Cold War in the mid-1940s. But by 1950, with the North Korean invasion of South Korea, it was kind of hard to deny that there was something like a Cold War. You kind of need a hot war to make the Cold War clear. And I think just as Cold War I was essentially and primarily transatlantic, and therefore the first hot war happened in Asia, so Cold War II is essentially trans-Pacific, and appropriately enough, the first hot war of Cold War II is in Europe. Ukraine has become a proxy for the United States and its allies, not only NATO, but other US allies. The war is being waged not only to secure Ukraine's democracy and independence, but also to bleed the Russian military dry. China is not directly assisting the Russian war effort, but indirectly assists it by being the buyer of last resort of Russian energy, particularly oil. And Russia's trade with China has increased enormously in the course of this year. The question that this prompts in my mind is, do we now move from the Korean War to the Cuban Missile Crisis in a rather shorter time frame that happened in Cold War I? The equivalent of a Cuban Missile Crisis today would be a crisis over Taiwan. As in the 1950s and early 1960s, Taiwan is an island just off the coast of one of the superpowers. It is a contested island, though contested in different ways. And my preoccupation at the moment is that we're closer to a Taiwan crisis, comparable in its scale to the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, than most people realize. It's not just that the Biden administration has been talking in much less ambiguous terms about its commitment to Taiwan's defense than previous administrations. It's also that the American public seems far more willing to contemplate the use of US troops if China attempts to invade Taiwan. This is a question that has been asked of the American public repeatedly all the way back to the 1980s. In 1982, only 19% of Americans said they would be willing to support the use of US troops if China invaded Taiwan. That rose to a peak of around 33% in 2004, then dwindled again. In the most recent survey by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, the number is 52%. So for the first time, we have a majority of Americans willing to contemplate the use of US troops in the event of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. Now, this is quite a dangerous state of affairs for the United States. Like in Cold War I, so in Cold War II, Cold War implies a global challenge, not one that's regionally confined, but in fact could occur simultaneously in at least three regions. I'd call this the three body of water problem. The United States could conceivably face crises in the North Atlantic, the Persian Gulf, and the Pacific in roughly the same time frame. Imagine, for example, that the crisis in Ukraine is followed next year by a crisis over Iran in the Middle East, and then the following year by a crisis over Taiwan in the Far East. It would be very hard for the United States to cope simultaneously with all three. And in that sense, the United States now faces a real axis, unlike the imaginary axis of evil that David Frum came up with for George W. Bush back in 2002. If you remember, that was Iran, Iraq, and North Korea, which never really had any meaningful relationship to one another. Indeed, Iran and Iraq were bitter foes. Today's axis, which I won't call an axis of evil, I'll just call it an axis of ill will between China, Russia, and Iran, is a reality. It's a reality in that China is a major buyer of Iran's oil, evading US sanctions. It's a reality in that Iran is supplying drones and pretty soon missiles to Russia. It's a reality, as I mentioned, in that China is a key trading partner, the most important trading partner that Russia now has. I don't think it's clear that the United States is ready for a three-region conflict against a real axis. In a couple of respects, I think we should be concerned. One is just the speed with which we have run down stocks of US weaponry in the conventional domain since the Ukraine war began. A huge number of javelins and stingers have been used up. There is a clear constraint on the US capacity to manufacture weapons like this at scale. I'd go further and say that the US is also in some measure behind the curve in the next revolution in military affairs that we might associate with the application of artificial intelligence to weapons systems. So I'm nervous not only about American ability to manufacture on scale conventional weapons, I'm nervous too about how ready the United States is for the new shape of warfare in which the drone swarm is the new enemy. I'd go further and say, if I think about the predicament of the United States economically, socially, and politically, this would be a really quite terrible time for the US to have to fight on more than one front. Let's look at the surge of inflation that has characterized the past year. Let's think of the enormous increase in the federal debt in relation to GDP since the financial crisis, and particularly as a result of COVID. Although the US economy is still humming along, and there seems no visible sign that the Federal Reserve's interest rate hikes are going to cause a recession, it's hard to believe that this kind of growth and this level of employment can be sustained next year after a doubling of mortgage rates, to give just one example. Socially, the United States is in many ways deeply divided. There is a kind of cultural conflict going on in American education, in the American media, and online. And politically, the country is deeply divided, though I sometimes think that the talk of polarization gets somewhat exaggerated. One way of putting this kind of comparison in context is to ask, if the United States was more or less polarized during Cold War I. Cold War I, of course, saw McCarthyism in its early phase, and it saw bitter divisions over the Vietnam War in its middle period. And in some respects, those divisions were deeper and more bitter than the divisions of today. But if I put together the economic, social, and political situation of the United States, it seems to be much closer to the situation in the early 1970s than the situation in, say, the late 1980s. And that's why I've been arguing for some time that the United States needs to dust down the détente playbook, not because the United States should trust the People's Republic of China any more than it trusted the Soviet Union in the 1970s, but simply because détente might be the right strategy to play for time, at a time when the United States is, in many ways, in a weakened state, and things are only going to get worse for its principal adversary, China. What was smart about détente in the 1970s was that it gave the United States time to recover from the divisions and the setback of Vietnam, and it also gave the Soviet Union time to deteriorate economically and overreach geopolitically. My sense is that if the United States avoids a showdown over Taiwan in the next few years, puts off such a showdown for perhaps a rather longer period, then time is very much on its side. I don't know how you fix China today, even without the zero COVID policy that's paralyzing its economy. There already were profound demographic challenges and financial challenges. China's population could halve between now and the end of this century if you look at the scenarios that the United Nations population projections produce. And of course, the debt dynamics in its real estate sector are truly horrific, recalling Japan in the late 1980s. Time is on the side of the United States, as it was in Cold War I. All the US really needs to do is fix immigration, make illegal immigration harder and legal immigration easier, and it becomes a natural magnet for just about all the entrepreneurial talent in the world. There's no easy way for China to address its demographic and debt dynamics, and there's no easy way for China to get out of its zero COVID trap. In that sense, I'm an optimist about Cold War II. I think the United States is as likely to win Cold War II as it was to win Cold War I. But I like to remind people that it wasn't guaranteed that the United States would win Cold War I. There were times at which it could have gone very wrong indeed. Obviously, if World War III had broken out over Cuba, or if World War III had broken out accidentally in 1983, we'd live in a very different world today. So the bottom line is that this probably is a good time to do détente rather than have a showdown in more than one theater of war. And if the next president of the United States understands that reality, if President DeSantis can take advantage of the inherent strengths of the United States, then he should be able to preside over victory in Cold War II, just as another Ronald Reagan, presided ultimately over victory in Cold War I. Thanks very much.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, this concludes our panel discussion, and I'd like to ask you to give a very warm hand to all of the speakers, those who appeared virtually and here in person. Thank you all so much. Please feel free to return to your seats. Now, our final speaker for tonight is, along with John and Melissa, I guess you could say, part of the holy trinity of the Danube Institute, one of the people keeping this place alive and doing the important work that you're all here to experience today. The world right now, as we've seen in our conference, is looking a bit like an unfamiliar landscape. It's not a new landscape per se. It's one where the roads are beginning to wear down, the signposts may not point to anything, and finding a way forward becomes the imperative. Here to speak with us about Hungary's place in that landscape, how Hungary will find its way forward, is none other than István Kiss. So please give him a very warm hand as he comes up to take the stage. Thank you.
Thank you all for the kind words. Trying to adjust this a bit. Doing the right thing. Well, I would like to start with saying that it's a great privilege to be here with you, and also partly contradict myself, because it's a huge privilege to stand on stage with such distinguished speakers which we had here during these past 2, we could also perhaps say 3 days. But because of this, it's partly a thankless job as well, because it's difficult to close, properly close, and be as important as some of these great speakers have been. It's also thankless in a sense that I have to give kind of a closing remark, but also do a presentation, which I'm not sure how I will manage with that, but but let's see. So. Because it's a geopolitical conference, I wanted to start with a map. We'll have several other maps as well. I also tried to mimic the map used in the logo of the conference to show where Hungary is. And, you know, this map is not very flattering to Hungary, because Hungary is that small little red dot in a huge... That's true. Some Hungarians would even say that it's the heart chakra of the earth. So yes, it's in the middle of the world to some extent, but also it's a small country well, actually not a small country. It's considered a middle-sized country, but we Hungarians sometimes like to think of ourselves as a small country, and to some extent it is. So it's 93,000 square kilometers. We have about 10 million Hungarian-speaking people in Hungary, but even if we include all the ethnic Hungarians living in the neighboring countries, or the quite significant Hungarian diaspora living mostly in the Western world, we will still get mostly less than 50 million people, which is not a lot. And also we have a very unique language, which kind of made Hungarians always feel at once special, but also threatened throughout their history, that they will lose their national identity and language because they are just this very unique people in the center of Europe. And if we zoom up a bit, you can see the Carpathian Basin, which gave place to Hungary. And it did give place to the Hungarian kingdom previously. You can see that from a geopolitical, let's say, situation, it's a lovely place. So you have the Carpathians defending Hungary, you have the Danube River south. So it should have been kind of a safe place to live, because geopolitically speaking, it has clearly defined borders, and borders which are easily defendable. But the truth is that it wasn't well, it was of course a good geopolitical place, but it wasn't a place which gave Hungarians peace of mind. I wrote in Central Europe, and this was the map Google and Wikipedia thrown out. I think you can, argue if this is really all the Central European countries or what are the Central European countries, but I didn't really bring this map to show Central Europe. I wanted to show that there is Central Europe. And of course, you can see that it's between what I would say the West and the East of Europe. And the West, historically speaking, was mostly the Holy Roman Empire, while the East was, for some time, actually Byzantine, later the different kind of Russian states, but also the Ottomans. So this region was always at the intersection of different cultural powers, but also empires. And because of this, Hungary had to suffer during this history several occupations. Just to name a few, the Mongols, the Ottomans. This is a famous painting of a famous Hungarian myth, which most likely never happened, but still we are kind of proud of the fact. There was this according to the myth, a Turkish or Ottoman soldier managed to climb one of the bastions of the Nándorfehérvár castle, which is basically today's Belgrade, in 1456, and almost managed to plant a flag on this bastion. But a very brave Hungarian soldier, noticing this but not being able to actually stop him, basically plunged himself to death with the Ottoman soldier, so the flag could still stay intact, and that in theory contributed to the victory of the Hungarians in the end. So we did have our share fights with the Ottomans and others. I put in this next picture to show that after the Ottomans, we sometimes consider the Habsburgs also as occupying Hungary, and of course we had several revolutions against the Habsburgs. The most famous is perhaps the 1948-49 revolution, which was actually put down with Russian help. So the Habsburgs didn't manage to put it down on their own. And I put this kind of sketch or painting here because this is actually the execution of Lajos Batthyány, who is the namesake of the foundation, which we are under the umbrella of. So I think it's kind of symbolic that we're in a building which is one of the biggest martyrs of Hungarian history. And the first Prime Minister of Hungary was executed. I mean, he was the first Prime Minister, but said he was executed afterwards. And of course, the Soviet Union and 1956. So we have been in a place, which is a map from the 12th century. Of course, borders constantly changed, but it still shows where Hungary was during, I would say, most of its history. And if you look at our history, we did have kings who managed to cleverly balance in this difficult geopolitical situation. Perhaps the most famous one is Saint Stephen, who established the Hungarian state, because he was in a difficult situation. I mean, he was between the Holy Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire, and he wanted to Christianize its own country, but he didn't want to become part of or kind of a subordinate to neither of these empires. So he managed to cut the Gordian knot by actually asking a crown. This is again myth, but this is actually a kind of well-established myth. So it's much more likely that this actually happened than Dugovic Titus and the Belgrade fort. So he asked the crown from the Pope, and he did receive the crown. And then he received bishops and people who could help convert the Hungarian population to Christianity. And with this maneuver, he basically managed to avoid being, for example, like the Kingdom of Czechia, which did receive a crown from the Holy Roman Empire and did receive bishops from the Holy Roman Empire and became part of the Holy Roman Empire because of this. Hungary did not, because of his maneuver. And of course, we had other kings who were quite successful, especially in the Middle Ages. And then we had kings who were not that successful. But I wanted to give you this kind of historic feedback, because now when we talk about Hungary and how the Hungarian government thinks, of course, if you think about geopolitical mindset, you have to understand Hungarian history as well. And I like to argue that now the Hungarian government is again playing somewhat of a balancing role, trying to keep Hungarian interest at a max, but also, of course, still firmly believing in the Western values and keeping also our NATO commitments alive as well. So I kind of want to make this historical comparison that Orbán, I don't want to make him sound like a king, but as some of the good kings during the medieval history of Hungary, he is similar in this sense that he's trying to be a good balancer of Hungarian national interest in a very difficult geopolitical situation. I brought you this picture because you hear a lot about how the current government of Hungary is perhaps a bit too friendly to Putin, too friendly to China, not properly committed to European values. And I disagree with these comments, but also interestingly, if you look at the history of democratic Hungary, the socialist government were actually perhaps even more friendly with Putin and China in some extent, which is an infamous visit of President Putin back in 2006, when the then Prime Minister of Hungary, Ferenc Gyurcsány, actually invited Putin to his own home and showed him his dog called Toto. Now, this never happened under Orban. So Orban never invited Putin to his own home, which I think is a very important distinction. But I also wanted to show this because, and of course, when his wife, who is also in this picture, now a European member of the European Parliament for Hungary, is attacking Hungary and accusing the current government of Hungary of being too pro-Putin. It's kind of, how should I say, perhaps dishonest is a strong word, but kind of double standard, certainly. So why is this? Why is that seemingly when you're in government, you want to have quite decent relations with Russia, and when you're in opposition, you are attacking the person who is trying to do that, which you can see now because Fidesz was a bit more anti-Russian back when it was in opposition. This is one thing. I'm sorry, but it's in Hungarian. This is the percentage of Russian oil in the Hungarian economy since just checking 2013. You can see that it's still pretty high. It's on a downward spiral, and the green line is actually the V4 average. So Hungary is actually, in this sense, less dependent on Russian oil than the V4 average, which is actually pretty good, but still pretty much dependent. So this is oil, and for gas, actually, I found several different charts, and sadly, I'm not an expert on energy issues, so I'm not sure what is the actual case, and that's why I brought two different charts on energy, gas, in this sense. According to this, Hungary is one of the most dependent countries on Russian gas in Europe. And there's another one which has completely different numbers. It's from a later year, but only a year later, so I'm not sure which one is the case. But that doesn't really matter because it does show that Hungary is sadly very much dependent on Russian gas, was very much dependent, and although with oil this has been decreasing in the past 10 years, it's still a significant issue. So when Hungary has to deal with Russia, it has to remind itself of its history, of the occupation of Russians of Hungary during its past, but it also has to acknowledge that it sadly has a huge dependency on Russian energy sources, which of course other European countries have as well. So Hungary is not alone in this situation, but to understand why Hungary is perhaps was trying to have for a long time pretty decent relations with Russia is also partly explained by this dependency of energy. Another picture of a socialist prime minister from 2002, Prime Minister Medgyessy, meeting who actually invited the then president of China, Hu Jintao, to Budapest. And actually, Hungary was one of the first countries. Logan could tell you more about this, hopefully, when his fellowship has ended here in Hungary, because one of his research topics is East Asian investments in Hungary. But Hungary was one of the first countries which tried to mend relations with China after the regime change. Because after the regime change, most communist countries tried to cut all ties with China, kind of as a distancing themselves from the communist past. But Hungary, back in around 2002, realized that China is a developing country and has to have pretty decent relations with China. And then the socialist prime minister actually visited China, and then this was replicated by the Chinese president as well. So the socialist government was trying to have a pretty good relation with China, which is to some extent still continued by the now conservative government. But again, why is this? I think Hungary was trying to reproduce what other European countries were doing. And if actually you check foreign investment or trade relations between, let's say, our own region and China and compare that to, let's say, other Western European countries, it's still basically nothing. So foreign direct investment of Chinese foreign direct investment going to countries like Italy or the UK is much higher than, actually it's more than double or 3 times higher than the whole foreign direct investment of China to the whole V4 region. So when you hear that, China is trying to use Hungary or Central Europe as a kind of a backdoor to Europe, I'm not saying it's completely untrue, but also he's using Western Europe as a backdoor to Europe as well in a much bigger percentage. So these were I would say, what are we doing? But I wanted to show you also that despite efforts of having decent relations with Russia and China, Hungary's trade partners and foreign direct investment coming into Hungary is still very much Western dominated. Sadly, I only found this table from 2020, which was in English. But if you look at the newest data, China is no longer in the top 10 exporters to Hungary, which is pretty interesting because in 2 years there was a significant shift. And actually, the United States came in as the second, both in the imports and exports to and from Hungary. So now if you would look at the latest figures of 2022, actually China is, and Russia is no longer in the top 10 economic partners of Hungary, and most economic partners of Hungary are actually from Europe, and now, surprisingly, the United States. Also, if you look at the overall average of Hungarian trade, it's usually around 70 or even higher percentage of all trade is with other European countries, European Union member countries. Another thing which I wanted to talk about a bit is Hungary's firm commitment to NATO. Because I think this is something which is overshadowed. So, as I said, there's a lot of talk about Hungary perhaps not doing enough in Ukraine, Hungary perhaps being too friendly with China, which as I said, I would try to put in a historical context, but I would also like to say that I don't think it's really true or as big as a problem as a lot of the people, let's say, progressive Western media would like to show. But on the other half, there's things which nobody really talks about. One thing was that the trade of Hungary is still very much Western-oriented. But the second one is Hungary's commitments to NATO and other, let's say, Western alliances. On the defense sharing conference, we had the defense minister here who talked about Hungary's commitment to reach the 2% of GDP military or defense spending. Now, we actually promised to do this until 2024, but now because of the war, we trying to do this actually in 2023. So there's a promise that Hungary will reach the recommendation of NATO next year, which, of course, you can say they should be doing that for a long time, which is true. But I think it's still, especially if you look at the economic situation of today, it's a very big thing that Hungary is now trying to put more and more money in its own defense and trying to kind of be a strong and good ally to the NATO in this sense as well. And also our commitments. So Hungary was part of the coalition of the willing. We supported American intentions in Afghanistan and Iraq. We actually sent their soldiers. So Hungary had a pretty decent contingent compared to other similar-sized countries in Afghanistan. We also had a pretty big commitment in Iraq, which is still ongoing. So unlike some other countries, Hungary has committed, and actually we did promise that Hungarian soldiers are going to stay in Iraq at least until the end of 2023. We had a nice Kurdish delegation here, a couple of generals who are very thankful for Hungary for being there and doing its job. I also visited the Hungarian soldiers there. They have a very good relation with other NATO members there, and also with the Kurds. Also, I think it's very significant that Hungary is trying to step up in its immediate neighborhood. So Hungary has a pretty big contingent of soldiers in Kosovo, around 500 people, and also, which was a very big accomplishment, last fall, a Hungarian has been appointed the commander of the NATO peace mission in Kosovo, which is basically unprecedented for a smaller country like Hungary. And beside this, Hungary has been very active in actually United Nations and European Union missions all across the globe. I just put in a couple of the bigger ones like Bosnia, Cyprus, and Egypt. So I would say defense-wise, Hungary is a very strong and committed member of NATO. And all the talk about Hungary shifting towards other corporations or other parts of the world is simply not true. Well, my presentation is basically, that was my presentation. I think I tried to show how Hungary, during its history, has been in this very difficult geopolitical situation where it sometimes had to balance its national interest between different powers, which I think it's still doing, but firmly committed to the Western civilization, as it has been since Saint Stephen, by the way. And just to say some last words on this, is that it is true that Hungary, because of its unique language and its history, has some, I would say, ties towards the East. Of course, János Hovay, I'm not sure if still, yes, could tell you much more about Hungary and Turkish relations or Central Asian relations. Those are important to Hungary. But I would also say that being part of the Christian nations, being part of NATO is much more important. So a lot of people like to think of Hungary as a ferry, which is somehow between the West and the East, and ferrying people, thoughts, ideas between these two parts. I never agreed with this sentiment. I think even if Hungary is a ferry, its home base is definitely in the West, and sometimes it does try to be a ferry or can to be a connection between the West and the East, but always in support of the West. So thank you, that was my presentation, but also as a concluding remarks, I would just like to say thank you first to our wonderful audience, of those who stayed with us until this late hour. I would also like to thank, of course, our wonderful speakers, most prominently Václav Klaus, the former president of the Czech Republic, and of course Tony Abbott, the former Prime Minister of Australia. I would also like to thank some of our organizing partners who were perhaps a bit more involved in the Defense Sharing Conference, but also supported us with their people and ideas for the Geopolitical Conference, meaning the Heritage Foundation, they were very generous and allowed some of their speakers to stay with us for an extra day. I would also like to thank the International Republican Institute, Réka Szemerkényi, who was, I think, a huge support in the conference. And of course, last but not least, my colleagues. First, our president, John O'Sullivan, who with his huge intellectual network, I think made this conference possible in I would say, theory or ideas. And of course, Melissa O'Sullivan, who was, I think, if John was the brain, Melissa was the heart of the conference. And of course, all my other colleagues, I just want to name a few of them because if John was the brain, Melissa the heart, I think they were the legs and arms who made the conference possible. Dorina, Anna, Bátor, Rebecca, and all the others working with Danube. I think you put in a huge job. We're very grateful for you all. And hopefully we will see you in a similar conference sometime next year in a similar situation. So thank you all for being with us. It has been a great pleasure. I hope you have a very nice weekend. Thank you.